Li Meifeng is a scholar with a mind for numbers and a low tolerance for inefficiency. In the Imperial court, her skills are overlooked because of her gender, but when she is sent to the Borderlands to audit the estate of General Long Wei, a man who can lead an army of 10,000 but cannot account for a single bag of rice, the real battle begins. Between chaotic scrolls, a crumbling estate, and the general's infuriating habit of training Shirtless in the courtyard while she's trying to do math, Meifeng must decide if she's there to fix his books or his heart. They say love is unpredictable, and today's story proves it. Welcome to Romance Crave Stories, where every episode is full of passion, secrets, and emotional twists. Let's begin. The southern border was not, in Meifeng's professional opinion, a place for civilized people. It was dusty, it was loud, and according to the scrolls she had been sent to review, it was a financial catastrophe. Meifeng adjusted the sleeves of her sage green scholar's robes, brushing off a layer of grit as she stood before the heavy iron gates of the general's estate. She clutched her wooden abacus like a shield. Back in the capital, the men of the Imperial treasury had laughed when she volunteered for this assignment. They called it housecleaning. Meifeng called it a mission. "I am Li Meifeng, Imperial auditor," she announced to the guard at the gate. "I am here to see General Long Wei regarding his creative interpretation of the military budget." The guard looked at her, then at the abacus, then at the tiny blush pink ribbon tied around her hair. The only feminine indulgence she allowed herself. "The general is busy. In the training grounds." "I don't care if he's currently wrestling a tiger," Meifeng snapped, her eyes narrowing. "His quarterly reports are 3 months late, and he's billed the emperor for 16 tactical goats. I need an explanation." She marched past the guard before he could stop her. She didn't have to look far to find the general. The sound of clashing steel led her to the central courtyard, where a man was moving with the lethal grace of a dragon. General Long Wei was, unfortunately, exactly as the rumors described. He was tall, built like a mountain, and currently, in a move Meifeng considered a direct assault on her focus, entirely shirtless. Sweat glistened on his back as he swung a heavy glaive, the muscles of his shoulders rippling with every strike. Meifeng stopped dead in her tracks. Her thumb flicked a bead on her abacus purely out of nervous habit. 1, 2, 3. Gorgeous reasons to turn around and go back to the capital. "General!" she called out, her voice higher than she intended. Long Wei spun around, the tip of his glaive stopping inches from her toes. He wiped sweat from his brow with a forearm, his dark eyes scanning her from her sensible boots to her furious face. "You're small for an assassin," he grunted, a slow, annoying smirk spreading across his face. "I am not an assassin, General. I am your worst nightmare," Meifeng said, regaining her composure and stepping forward. "I am a woman with a ledger, and I've noticed that you spent more on fine wine last month than you did on iron for your soldiers' spears. Care to explain the tactical goats?" The general leaned on his glaive, looking at her with a mixture of confusion and sudden intense interest. "They are for clearing the brush on the northern hills. Very efficient. They are currently grazing in your private garden and wearing silk ribbons," Meifeng countered, pulling a scroll from her sleeve. "This estate is a logistical disaster, General, and I'm not leaving until every copper is accounted for." Long Wei let out a deep rumbling laugh that made the air in the courtyard feel suddenly very warm. "A scholar at the border? This should be entertaining. Tell me, Scholarly, does that abacus of yours have a setting for stubbornness?" "No," Meifeng said, her heart doing a very unprofessional somersault. "But it's excellent for hitting people who don't take their taxes seriously." Chapter 1. The general's study was not a room. It was a physical manifestation of chaos. When Li Meifeng pushed open the heavy cedar doors the morning after her arrival, she fully expected a mess. What she found, however, was a war zone of literature. Bamboo slips were piled in haphazard mounds on the floor. Silk scrolls of varying importance were carelessly tossed over the backs of elaborately carved chairs. A magnificent, terrifyingly sharp broadsword was currently serving as a paperweight for what appeared to be the garrison's monthly grain inventory. It was a poorly posed system of equations with no initial conditions and absolutely no baseline. Meifeng took a deep centering breath, inhaling the scent of old paper, stale ink, and the lingering masculine scent of sandalwood that seemed to permeate the entire estate. She rolled up the wide sleeves of her sage green robes, tying them back with a simple linen cord. From her satchel she withdrew her weapons, a fresh block of fine soot ink, a wolf hair brush, her trusty wooden abacus, and 3 spools of silk ribbon she had purchased from a merchant on the journey south. Right, she murmured to the empty room. Let's establish some parameters. For 4 hours, Meifeng became a whirlwind of optimization. She ruthlessly sorted the scrolls into categories. Military correspondence was bound in bold, unyielding crimson. Financial records and treasury disputes were tied with a soft, blush pink ribbon. General logistics, including the infuriatingly vague records of the tactical goats, were secured with a soothing cream color. She arranged the categorized scrolls onto the previously barren shelves, creating a visually pleasing minimalist aesthetic that brought immediate peace to her highly structured mind. The broadsword was respectfully relocated to a weapon rack where it belonged. She was just finishing the final calculations on the spring tea budget, her fingers flying across the abacus beads with practiced rhythmic clacks, when the heavy cedar doors were pushed open. General Long Wei stepped over the threshold, still clad in his dark leather training armor, a damp towel draped over his broad shoulders. He took one step into the room and stopped dead, his dark eyes sweeping over the newly instituted order. "What?" the general said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble that vibrated right through the soles of Meifeng's sensible boots. "Have you done to my command center?" "I fixed it," Meifeng replied brightly, not looking up from her abacus. "You had a severe data structuring problem, General. It was impossible to track your supply chain when your quartermaster reports were buried under love letters from the local magistrate's daughter." Long Wei's jaw tightened. Those were diplomatic correspondences. They were highly perfumed and contained 3 different poems comparing your eyes to obsidian, Meifeng countered, finally glancing up. She tapped the top of a small, neatly stacked pile on the edge of the desk. "I've filed them under non-essential foreign relations." "You're welcome." The general let out a sound that was half sigh, half growl. He crossed the room with 3 long ground-eating strides, entirely ignoring the boundaries of professional space as he leaned over the heavy oak desk. He was so close she could feel the heat radiating from his skin, the sandalwood scent suddenly overpowering. "Where is the Northern Patrol route map?" he demanded, leaning closer. Meifeng leaned back slightly, her heart doing a completely irrational flutter against her ribs. She swallowed hard, refusing to let him intimidate her. "Crimson ribbon. Second shelf from the top. Chronologically organized by lunar phase." Long Wei blinked, the aggressive posture faltering for a fraction of a second. He turned his head, his gaze landing precisely on the crimson-bound scroll resting exactly where she had said. He reached out and snatched it off the shelf, untying the ribbon and letting it fall open. He stared at it. It was exactly the Northern Patrol route map. "And the blacksmith's ledger?" he asked, his voice dropping an octave, his eyes narrowing as he looked back down at her. "Blush pink ribbon. Bottom left drawer." Meifeng answered instantly, matching his intense stare. "Though I should warn you, your blacksmith is overcharging you for iron, or by nearly 12%. I've drafted a culturally appropriate, but highly threatening missive for you to send him in the morning." Silence stretched between them, thick and crackling with an energy that had absolutely nothing to do with Imperial audits. Long Wei stared at her, the annoyance in his eyes slowly, visibly morphing into a begrudging, fascinated respect. He looked at the blush pink ribbons, then at the abacus under her hand, and finally at her face. "You," the general murmured, leaning in just an inch closer, "are a very terrifying woman, scholarly." "Efficiency is only terrifying to the disorganized, General Long," Meifeng whispered back, refusing to break eye contact even as her pulse hammered in her ears. A slow, wicked smile spread across Long Wei's face, transforming him from a hardened warrior into something far more dangerous. He reached out, his callous fingers lightly brushing against the wooden frame of her abacus, sending a jolt of electricity straight up her arm. "Very well," he said softly. "Let's see what else you can fix." Chapter 2. The first 48 hours of the Imperial audit had been remarkably productive. Meifeng had successfully established a color-coded inventory system, drafted a sternly worded missive to the price-gouging blacksmith, and managed to ignore the fact that the general of the southern border possessed shoulders that could eclipse the sun. She was currently sitting in the study, a cup of jasmine tea cooling by her elbow, reviewing the latest dispatch from the capital. The morning air was crisp, the estate was quiet, and the numbers were finally beginning to align. Then came the sound. It wasn't the clash of swords or the heavy march of boots. It was a wet, rhythmic crunching. Meifeng lowered her brush. She slowly peered over the edge of the heavy oak desk. Standing in the center of her meticulously organized sanctuary was a goat. It was a remarkably stout, smug-looking creature, its white coat peppered with gray spots. Tied around its left horn, fluttering innocently in the breeze from the open window, was a strip of blush pink silk. But it was what the goat was eating that made Meifeng's blood run cold. Dangling from the creature's mouth was a heavy parchment scroll. At the bottom of the scroll, hanging by a thread of pulverized paper, was a massive unmistakable wax seal stamped with the 5-clawed dragon of the Imperial throne. "Drop it," Meifeng whispered, standing up so slowly she barely disturbed the air. The goat chewed faster. "Hey!" Meifeng lunged. With a bleat of defiance, the goat spun on its hooves, executed a flawless evasive maneuver that would have made a cavalry commander weep with pride, and bolted out the open cedar doors. "Stop that livestock!" Meifeng shrieked, entirely abandoning her imperial dignity as she hiked up the skirts of her sage-green robes and sprinted after it. She burst into the central courtyard just in time to see the goat careen past a line of spear-wielding recruits. The soldiers froze, staring in bewildered horror as the stern, terrifying Imperial auditor flew past them, brandishing a wooden abacus like a blunt weapon. "General!" Meifeng yelled, spotting Long Wei near the armory. He was, thankfully, fully clothed today in dark, form-fitting tunic and trousers, discussing patrol routes with his lieutenant. He looked up, his brow furrowing. "Skulali! Why are you? Your tactical asset is committing treason!" she screamed, pointing at the white blur currently scaling a stack of supply crates. "It has the Imperial mandate." Long Wei's eyes widened as he spotted the yellow wax seal dangling from the goat's mouth. "Sergeant Bai!" he roared, immediately springing into action. "Flank it left. Scholarly. Cut off the eastern corridor." "I am an auditor, not a shepherd," Meifeng shot back, though she was already running toward the corridor, calculating the goat's trajectory based on its current velocity and the angle of the crates. "It's heading for the kitchens." The chase was a disaster of epic proportions. The goat, who Long Wei breathlessly informed her was named Commander Whiskers, dodged 3 soldiers, leaped over a cart of cabbages, and darted into the estate's sprawling back gardens. "He's using the terrain to his advantage," Long Wei panted, skidding to a halt beside Meifeng near the edge of a massive, decorative lotus pond. "He knows we won't risk damaging the Emperor's seal in the mud." "He doesn't know anything, he's a ruminant," Meifeng snapped, her chest heaving. Her carefully tied hair was rapidly escaping its pins. "If he swallows the logistics for the winter rations, your men will starve." "I am open to strategic suggestions, scholar," Long Wei said, his dark eyes sparkling with a completely inappropriate amount of amusement. He was enjoying this. The madman was actually enjoying this. Meifeng narrowed her eyes, scanning the garden. The goat was currently backed against a high stone wall, chewing methodically. "Calculated distraction," Meifeng declared. She reached into her sleeve and pulled out a small, dried apricot she had saved from breakfast. "I will approach from the front with a superior asset. You flank him from behind the cherry blossom tree. When he drops the scroll for the fruit, you secure the perimeter." "Secure the perimeter." "Understood." The general offered her a sharp military salute that was entirely mocked by the grin on his face. Meifeng took a deep breath, smoothed down the front of her rumpled robes, and took a slow step forward. "Commander Whiskers," she cooed, holding out the apricot. "Look what I have. High-yield caloric density. Far superior to dry parchment." The goat paused. It looked at the apricot. It looked at the scroll. Slowly it lowered its head, letting the half-chewed mandate drop to the grass. It took a step toward Meifeng. "Now," she yelled. Long Wei vaulted out from behind the tree with the agility of a jungle cat. He didn't just secure the perimeter. He tackled the goat. It was a tangle of dark fabric, white fur, and indignant bleating. Meifeng dove for the grass, snatching the slobber-covered Imperial mandate just as Long Wei managed to pin the struggling goat to the ground, securing its horns. Meifeng sat up on her knees, clutching the rescued scroll to her chest. She looked over at the general of the southern border. He was lying in the dirt, wrestling a goat, a stray cherry blossom petal stuck to his cheek. His chest heaved with laughter, a deep booming sound that echoed off the garden walls. "Well executed, scholarly," Long Wei grinned, looking up at her from the grass. "Your battlefield tactics are impeccable." Meifeng looked down at the ruined, saliva-soaked emperor's mandate in her hands. Then she looked at the fearsome warrior currently being outmaneuvered by a farm animal. Despite her best efforts to maintain her icy professional facade, a laugh burst from her lips, bright, chaotic, and completely unguarded. Long Wei's laughter faded. He stared up at her, the amusement in his eyes shifting into something quieter, something heavy and intensely focused that made the garden suddenly feel incredibly small. He had seen her calculate. He had seen her scold. But as she sat in the grass with her hair falling out of its pins, laughing over a chewed-up scroll, he looked at her like she was the most fascinating puzzle he had ever encountered. And Meifeng, gripping the damp parchment, realized with a sinking feeling that the biggest threat to this audit wasn't the disorganized ledgers at all. Chapter 3. By the fourth night of the audit, Meifeng had established a rhythm. The estate slept, the tactical goats were securely penned, and the only sound in the general's study was the rhythmic, comforting clack-clack-clack of her abacus beads. She sat cross-legged at the low oak desk, illuminated by the warm, flickering glow of a single paper lantern. She had swapped her formal daytime robes for a softer, unbelted silk layer in a muted sage, her hair falling freely down her back. She was currently attempting to reconcile the armory's missing shipment of arrowheads when the heavy cedar door slid open with a soft snick. Meifeng didn't flinch. "I told the guards I didn't need any more hot water, thank you. I am not a guard, Scholarly. And you have been staring at those bamboo slips for 14 hours. Meifeng's fingers paused on the wooden beads. She looked up. General Long Wei stood in the doorway, a steaming porcelain cup in each hand. He was dressed down for the night in loose-fitting dark trousers and a simple linen shirt that was unlaced at the throat, revealing a distracting expanse of sun-bronzed skin. His dark hair was loose, falling past his broad shoulders, making him look less like an imperial general and more like a dangerous, wandering swordsman from a folklore tale. "I am optimizing," Meifeng said softly, acutely aware of how quiet the room suddenly felt. "The arrowheads won't count themselves." Long Wei crossed the room, his footsteps completely silent on the woven floor mats. He set one of the cups on her desk. The scent of roasted oolong and honey curled into the air. "The arrowheads have been missing for 6 months, he pointed out, sinking gracefully onto the floor cushion directly across the low desk from her. He was far too large for the small space, his knees practically brushing the edge of the wood. "They can wait until sunrise. Incompetence does not sleep, General." Meifeng picked up the tea, letting the ceramic warm her chilled hands. "Thank you for the tea." Long Wei took a sip from his own cup, his dark eyes watching her over the rim. In the lantern light, the sharp angles of his face were softened by shadows. "I owe you. You saved the Emperor's mandate from my finest strategic ruminant." Meifeng allowed a small, tired smile to touch her lips. "Commander Whiskers is a formidable opponent." The general chuckled, a low vibration that seemed to settle right in Meifeng's chest. Silence drifted over them again, but it wasn't the hostile silence of her first day. It was companionable, almost intimate. Long Wei's gaze dropped to the abacus resting between them. He reached out, his large finger lightly tapping one of the wooden beads on the upper deck. Clack. "My father tried to teach me to use one of these when I was a boy," he confessed softly, staring at the instrument. "I broke it within an hour. He decided my hands were better suited for a sword." Meifeng looked at his hands. They were massive, heavily scarred, and callous from years of gripping hilts and reins. The idea of those hands trying to delicately manipulate the tiny wooden beads was both tragic and strangely endearing. "It's not about strength, General," Meifeng said. She set her teacup down. "It's about logic. The upper beads represent 5. The lower beads represent 1. It's simply a visual representation of order." Long Wei looked up at her, the intensity in his eyes making her breath hitch. "Show me." Meifeng hesitated. Teaching him meant breaking the safe, professional distance she had been desperately trying to maintain across the desk. But he was looking at her not as a general commanding a subordinate, but as a student asking for guidance. "Move your cushion to this side," she murmured. Long Wei stood and moved around the small desk, sitting on the mat right beside her. His shoulder brushed against hers. He smelled intensely of sandalwood and the crisp night air. "Give me your hand," Meifeng instructed, her voice miraculously steady. He offered his right hand, palm down. Meifeng gently took it. Her own hands were small, her fingers stained with ink, but as she guided his massive hand over the wooden frame of the abacus, she felt entirely in control. "Index and thumb," she said softly, positioning his fingers over the rightmost column. To add 3, push 3 earth beads up with your thumb. Long Wei moved his thumb. He was clumsy, his large digit pushing 4 beads instead of 3. Gently, Meifeng whispered, covering his hand with hers. His skin was rough, scarred, and impossibly warm. A jolt of electricity shot straight up her arm at the contact, but she forced herself to focus on the beads. She guided his thumb back down, then pushed exactly 3 beads up. Clack. 3, Long Wei breathed. He wasn't looking at the abacus. He was looking at her profile. Now at 2, Meifeng continued, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She guided his index finger to the top deck. Push the heaven bead down for 5, and clear the 3 earth beads. Together, their hands moved in a synchronized fluid motion. Clack clack. 5, she whispered. 5, he repeated. Meifeng didn't let go of his hand. She couldn't. Her fingers were lightly resting over his knuckles, her thumb resting against the heavy pulse point at his wrist. It was racing. She slowly turned her head to look at him. His face was mere inches from hers. The teasing arrogance of the general was completely gone, replaced by a dark, hungry vulnerability that made the air in the small study feel dangerously thin. His free hand slowly came up, his rough fingers lightly brushing against the stray hairs framing her cheek. He tucked a dark lock behind her ear, his thumb lingering against her jawline. You are very good at creating order, scholarly, Long Wei murmured, his voice dropping to a gravelly whisper, his gaze dropping to her lips. But I think you are wreaking absolute havoc on my discipline. Meifeng's breath caught in her throat. She should pull away. She should recite the penal code for inappropriate conduct during an Imperial audit. Instead, she leaned into his touch, her eyes fluttering shut as the space between them vanished. Chapter 4. The almost kiss of the previous night hung over the estate like a heavy, invisible fog. When Meifeng entered the study the next morning, her heart gave a traitorous leap at the sight of the general. He was standing by the window, fully armored, looking out over the training grounds. When he turned to face her, the intensity in his dark eyes made her immediately want to retreat behind the safety of her color-coded scrolls. Good morning, scholarly, Long Wei rumbled, his voice holding a hint of the gravelly warmth from the night before. General, Meifeng replied crisply, marching straight to the oak desk and hiding behind a towering stack of supply requisitions. She tied a cream-colored ribbon tightly around a bundle of bamboo slips, refusing to look at his hands. We have a problem. A mathematical impossibility. Meifeng stepped out from the shadows, her sage-green robe sweeping over the cobblestones. She held her abacus in one hand and a small lantern in the other. You are rotating it straight into the black market, Meifeng said coldly. She walked up to the dropped sack of rice and shone the lantern on it. At the bottom corner of the burlap, drawn in a specific luminescent blue ink, was a small elegant character. Li. I marked the premium grain inventory this afternoon, Meifeng explained, turning her sharp gaze onto the trembling cook. Her thumb flicked a bead on her abacus. Clack. Based on my calculations, you have embezzled approximately 400 taels of silver over the last 6 months. Gao wept, pressing his forehead to the dirt. It was a moment of weakness. I beg you, General, a swift death. Long Wei looked at the cook in disgust, then turned to Meifeng. What is the penalty for logistical treason, scholarly? Death deprives the estate of manual labor, Meifeng stated, her voice devoid of sympathy. She looked down at the cook. Master Gao will surrender the 400 taels from his personal savings by sunrise. Following that, he will be reassigned from head cook to the latrine sanitation detail for a period of 5 years, without pay, to work off the interest. The cook sobbed louder but nodded frantically. Yes, thank you, merciful scholar. Long Wei signaled for the guards to drag the cook away. As the courtyard fell quiet again, the general turned to look at Meifeng. The moonlight caught the sharp, intelligent gleam in her eyes as she tucked the abacus back into her sleeve. He had expected a delicate scholar from the capital who fainted at the sight of a sword. Instead, he had been sent a woman who could dismantle a man's entire life with a wooden counting frame and a pot of blue ink. Remind me, Long Wei murmured, taking a step closer, a slow, incredibly dangerous smile spreading across his lips. Never to cross you, Li Meifeng. You are more ruthless than half my lieutenants. I simply balance the ledgers, General, Meifeng said, though her breath hitched as he reached out and gently pulled the collar of his heavy cloak tighter around her neck. You do much more than that, he whispered, his thumb brushing against her collarbone. And this time, in the quiet aftermath of the trap, neither of them pulled away. Chapter 5. The border village of Qingshui was usually a sleepy, dusty settlement that existed primarily to supply the military garrison. But tonight it had transformed. It was the festival of the autumn moon, and the narrow streets were ablaze with hundreds of crimson and gold paper lanterns. The air was thick with the scent of roasted pork, sweet bean paste, and black powder from the firecrackers snapping at the edges of the square. I still fail to see how my presence here constitutes official Imperial business, Meifeng grumbled, adjusting the sleeves of her evening robes. She had abandoned the stark sage green for a softer, flowing silk dress in a pale cream, though she had stubbornly tied a blush pink ribbon around her waist to maintain some semblance of her usual color coding. Morale scholarly, Long Wei replied smoothly, walking close beside her to shield her from the jostling crowd. He wasn't wearing his armor tonight. Dressed in a dark, impeccably tailored silk tunic with silver embroidery at the collar, he looked less like a hardened border general and more like a devastatingly handsome nobleman who had taken a wrong turn out of the capital. The villagers need to see that the Emperor's auditor is not a terrifying phantom who only exists to punish cooks and count arrowheads. He continued, a teasing lilt to his voice. They need to see you integrating into the local culture. I am integrating, Meifeng said defensively, sidestepping a group of children chasing a stray dog. I've already mentally calculated the profit margins of 3 different noodle stalls. The one by the bridge is severely undercharging for extra scallions. Long Wei threw his head back and laughed, the sound warm and rich, turning the heads of several village women nearby. Meifeng felt a sudden, entirely irrational spike of territorial annoyance. You cannot optimize a festival, Meifeng, he chuckled, his use of her given name sending a distinct shiver down her spine. The formality of the study felt very far away. Watch me, she muttered, though the corners of her mouth twitched upward. The crowd surged as a troupe of acrobats began their performance in the center of the square. Long Wei reacted instantly, stepping behind Meifeng and placing a broad, warm hand firmly against the small of her back to keep her from being trampled. Stay close, he murmured, his breath stirring the loose hairs at her temple. Meifeng couldn't have moved away if she tried. She was acutely aware of the solid wall of muscle behind her, his hand serving as a protective anchor amidst the chaos. They moved through the market stalls in tandem, a bubble of quiet tension surrounded by the roaring festival. They paused near a merchant's cart illuminated by a particularly bright lantern. The cart was covered in velvet, displaying rows of delicate jewelry. Meifeng's eyes snagged on a specific piece resting near the edge. It was a hair comb, but unlike the heavy jade or gaudy gold pieces she usually saw in the capital, this was crafted from a unique warm metal, a delicate shimmering rose gold. It was shaped into a sweeping branch of cherry blossoms, the petals impossibly thin and elegant. It was utterly frivolous. It possessed zero practical utility, and it was the most beautiful thing she had seen in months. She stared at it for exactly 3 seconds before her practical brain violently reasserted control. She tore her eyes away, looking instead at a highly sensible wooden abacus 2 stalls down. We should check the perimeter of the festival, Meifeng said briskly, turning away from the cart. Ensure the garrison guards aren't drinking on duty. Wait here, Long Wei commanded softly. Before she could argue, he stepped up to the merchant's cart. He didn't browse. He pointed directly to the rose gold cherry blossom comb. He dropped a piece of silver onto the velvet, far more than the delicate item was worth, and picked it up. He turned back to Meifeng, closing the distance between them. General, Meifeng started, her voice suddenly breathless as she looked from the comb to his dark eyes. That is highly unnecessary. I do not require. Turn around, he interrupted gently. Meifeng swallowed hard. Slowly, she turned her back to him, facing the bustling crowd but seeing none of it. She felt his large, calloused hands gently gather the top half of her hair. His fingers were surprisingly deft, brushing against her scalp and sending a cascade of sparks down her neck. With a soft click, he slid the rose gold comb into her hair, securing the dark strands. He stepped back around to face her. The warm light of the paper lanterns caught the rose gold metal, reflecting a soft glow against her cheeks. Long Wei stared at her, the bustling festival entirely fading into the background. His chest rose and fell with a slightly uneven breath. There, he murmured, his voice dropping to a gravelly register that made her knees feel dangerously weak. A perfect fit. General, Meifeng whispered, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She reached up, her fingertips brushing the cool metal of the comb. I cannot accept this. It is a violation of the Imperial auditing code regarding gifts from the audited party. It constitutes a bribe. Long Wei stepped closer, his thumb reaching out to lightly brush the apple of her cheek. It is not a bribe, scholarly, he said, a slow, devastating smile touching his lips. Consider it a necessary business expense. An expense for what? She breathed, entirely trapped in the gravity of his gaze. For keeping the Imperial auditor in a favorable mood, he replied, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw. And because for a woman who spends her life surrounded by cold, hard numbers, you deserve something beautiful. Meifeng couldn't calculate a response. For the first time since arriving at the southern border, her mind was entirely blessedly blank. Chapter 6. Nature, Meifeng decided as a fat drop of freezing water slid down her collarbone, was the ultimate enemy of efficiency. They had ridden out at dawn to inspect a forward supply depot in the foothills of the jagged Jade Dragon Mountains. The morning had been clear, the calculations perfect. But by mid-afternoon, the sky had violently bruised into a deep, aggressive purple, unleashing a torrential downpour that turned the mountain passes into slick, treacherous rivers of mud. The roads are washing out, Long Wei shouted over the deafening roar of the rain, pulling his massive black warhorse up beside her smaller gray mare. Water streamed down his face, pasting his dark hair to his cheeks. We can't make it back to the estate before dark. There's an abandoned watchman's hut a mile up this ridge. We shelter there. Meifeng didn't argue. Her teeth were chattering so violently she feared she might bite her own tongue. She simply nodded, clinging to the reins as her mare slipped in the rising mud. By the time they reached the hut, Meifeng could barely feel her fingers. The structure was small, built of rough-hewn timber and fieldstone, with a roof that had certainly seen better dynasties. But it was dry inside, and in the corner sat a small stone hearth. Long Wei practically dragged her off her horse, rushing her inside before returning to secure the animals under the slight overhang of the roof. When he ducked back through the low wooden door, the small space instantly felt crowded. He stripped off his soaked leather bracers and heavy outer tunic, throwing them over a rotting wooden bench. He was left in his thin linen undershirt, which was currently plastered to his chest like a second skin, highlighting every heavily muscled contour. Meifeng rigidly averted her eyes, shivering violently in her ruined, mud-splattered silk robes. We need a fire, Long Wei muttered, dropping to his knees before the hearth. He pulled a small oilcloth-wrapped bundle from his remaining dry pouch. Flint, steel, and a handful of dry tinder. Within minutes a small desperate flame flickered to life, casting dancing orange shadows against the timber walls. He stood up and turned to her, his brow furrowing in deep concern. Meifeng was standing in the center of the room, clutching her arms to her chest, her lips carrying a distinct blue tint. You're freezing, he said, closing the distance between them. He reached into his saddlebag, which he had hauled inside, and pulled out a single thick wool blanket. It was the only dry textile in the entire hut. Take off your outer robe, he commanded softly. Meifeng's eyes widened, her shivering suddenly competing with a hot flush rising in her cheeks. General, that is highly improper. Hypothermia does not care about imperial propriety, Meifeng, he countered, his voice firm but undeniably gentle. Your silk is soaked. It's leaching the heat from your body. Take it off or I will take it off for you. She glared at him, a purely defensive mechanism, but her trembling hands moved to the blush-pink sash at her waist. She untied it with numb fingers, letting the heavy ruined sage-green silk slip from her shoulders and pool on the floor. She was left standing in her white linen underrobe. It was entirely modest by practical standards, but the damp fabric clung to her curves, making her feel wildly exposed. Long Wei didn't leer. His eyes were entirely focused on keeping her warm. He stepped forward and wrapped the heavy wool blanket tightly around her shoulders, pulling the edges together at her chest. Sit by the fire, he instructed, guiding her down to the hearth. Meifeng sank onto the dusty floorboards, pulling the blanket tight. Long Wei sat down right beside her. He didn't have a blanket, so he moved incredibly close, his broad shoulder pressing flush against hers, his long legs stretching out parallel to her own. Shared body heat, he murmured, anticipating her objection before she could voice it. A basic survival tactic. It's a logistical nightmare, Meifeng whispered, though she leaned into his solid, radiating warmth entirely of her own volition. The rain hammered relentlessly against the wooden roof, isolating them from the rest of the world. In the flickering firelight, Meifeng reached up to her wet, tangled hair. Her fingers brushed against cool metal. Miraculously, the rose-gold cherry blossom comb was still securely anchored in her hair. Long Wei noticed the movement. He shifted, turning his body slightly toward her. He reached out, his rough, warm fingers gently brushing a wet strand of hair away from the delicate metal petals. "I was afraid you would lose it in the mud," he said, his voice dropping to a gravelly, intimate register that barely carried over the crackle of the fire. "I am an auditor, General," Meifeng replied, looking up at him through her wet lashes, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm that had nothing to do with the cold. "I keep track of my valuable assets." Long Wei's breath hitched. His dark eyes dropped to her lips, the tension in the small, fire-lit hut suddenly thickening into something heavy and combustible. "And am I?" he whispered, his thumb lightly tracing the line of her jaw, sliding down to rest against the frantic pulse at her throat. "Am I one of your assets, Meifeng?" She couldn't look away. She didn't want to. "You are the most frustrating variable I have ever encountered," she breathed. A slow, devastating smile spread across Long Wei's face right before he leaned in, erasing the last fraction of distance between them. Chapter 7. The kiss was a catastrophic failure of logic. When Long Wei's lips met hers in the fire-lit gloom of the mountain hut, Meifeng's highly trained, analytical mind simply ceased to function. There were no columns, no ledgers, no imperial codes. There was only the rough texture of his skin, the intoxicating scent of sandalwood and rain, and the overwhelming, radiating heat of the general of the southern border. For 10 agonizingly perfect seconds, she had kissed him back, her fingers tangling in his damp hair, completely surrendering to the variable she couldn't control. Then, a massive crack of thunder had rattled the very foundations of the hut. The sound had shattered the spell, violently dragging Meifeng back to reality. She had pulled away, her chest heaving, and retreated to the farthest corner of the hearth, citing severe breaches of Imperial auditing protocols, with a voice that shook humiliatingly. Long Wei hadn't pushed. He had simply watched her across the fire, his dark eyes unreadable, until dawn broke. Now, 2 days later, the tension at the estate was tight enough to snap a bowstring. Meifeng stood on the covered veranda overlooking the courtyard, clutching a freshly drafted supply manifest. Below her, the garrison was in organized chaos. A contingent of 50 riders was preparing for a routine multi-day patrol along the western ridge. At the center of it all stood Long Wei. He was fully armored in dark, overlapping leather plates, a heavy sword strapped to his hip, but he was currently losing a battle against his own hair. He was trying to gather the heavy, dark mass into a functional topknot, but the thick leather bracers on his forearms were making his movements clumsy. After the third failed attempt, he let out a sharp sigh of frustration, letting the dark strands fall back over his shoulders. Before her brain could calculate the risks, Meifeng's feet were moving. She descended the wooden stairs, her sage-green robes whispering against the steps, and walked directly into the center of the chaotic courtyard. The soldiers instinctively parted for her. "General," Meifeng said quietly, stopping behind him. Long Wei turned. His expression was guarded, the easy warmth of the festival entirely locked away since the night in the hut. "Skulali. Is there an error in the patrol manifest?" "No," Meifeng said, suddenly feeling very small beneath his towering height. "But there is an error in your uniform preparation. You cannot ride into a high-wind environment with unsecured hair. It is a tactical disadvantage. It impairs peripheral vision." He stared down at her, his jaw tightening. "My attendant is currently recovering from a fever. I will manage." "Turn around, General," she instructed softly, stepping closer. Long Wei hesitated, but the quiet authority in her voice won out. He slowly turned his back to her, standing perfectly still. Meifeng reached up. She had to stand on her tiptoes just to reach the crown of his head. Her fingers tentatively brushed against his thick, dark hair. He was completely silent, but she could see the muscles of his broad back lock into rigid tension the moment she made contact. She gathered the heavy locks, smoothing them back from his temples. The physical proximity was dizzying. She was so close she could feel the heat radiating from his armor, completely enveloping her in his shadow. "Your hair is very thick," she murmured, her voice sounding raspy even to her own ears. She began to twist the dark mass, securing it high on his head. A family trait, he replied, his voice a low, rough rumble that vibrated through his chest and straight into her fingertips. Meifeng pulled the simple leather thong from his hand, wrapping it tightly around the topknot. But it looked frayed. It wouldn't hold through 3 days of hard riding. Without thinking, she reached down to the sash of her robes and untied the blush-pink silk ribbon she always wore. It was entirely inappropriate, a delicate feminine silk marking the fearsome general of the southern border, but she didn't care. She wrapped the silk ribbon around the base of his topknot, tying it in a secure, intricate knot she usually reserved for sealing the emperor's ledgers. There, Meifeng whispered, her hands dropping to her sides. Optimized. Long Wei slowly turned around. He reached up, his fingers brushing against the soft, blush-pink silk currently holding his hair in place. He looked at the ribbon, then looked down at Meifeng. The guarded, icy look was gone, completely shattered. In the middle of the bustling courtyard, surrounded by 50 armed men, Long Wei looked at her as if she were the only person within 1,000 miles. "Thank you, Meifeng," he murmured, the use of her given name sending a familiar, terrifying jolt straight to her heart. "Safe travels, General," she managed to say, taking a hurried step back. She turned and practically fled back up the veranda stairs, her heart hammering against her ribs. She was an Imperial auditor. She dealt in facts, in hard numbers, in unyielding logic. But as she watched Long Wei swing onto his massive black warhorse, the blush-pink ribbon fluttering in the wind like a vibrant, undeniable claim, Meifeng realized the most terrifying truth of all. Her calculations were entirely compromised. She was falling in love with him. Chapter 8. General Long Wei's 3-day patrol had stretched into 5, leaving Meifeng alone to manage the estate's chaotic ledgers. She should have been thrilled by the uninterrupted quiet. Instead, she found herself staring at the gates every hour, tapping her abacus with an uncharacteristic lack of focus. When a heavy carriage finally rolled into the courtyard on the afternoon of the 5th day, her heart gave a sharp, treacherous leap. She abandoned her scrolls and hurried to the veranda, only to stop dead in disappointment. It wasn't the general. Stepping out of the lacquered carriage was a man draped in so many layers of embroidered silk, he looked like a walking tapestry. He was followed by 4 servants carrying velvet-covered boxes. "Scholarly," the man bellowed, his voice dripping with an oily kind of charm. He practically waddled up the steps. The air around him was heavily saturated with musk and jasmine oil, completely overpowering the crisp mountain air. "I am Master Wang, the preeminent silk merchant of the western province. And you, my dear, are the talk of the trade routes." Meifeng clasped her hands formally, her face a mask of polite indifference. "Master Wang, to what do I owe this intrusion? The military textile contracts are not up for renewal until the spring quarter." "Business." Wang laughed, waving a hand adorned with 3 heavy jade rings. No. I am a man of culture. Scholarly word has reached my ear of a brilliant, beautiful woman from the capital sent to tame this wretched borderland. A woman of your intellect deserves a life of luxury, not dust and goat pens." He snapped his fingers. One of the servants stepped forward, opening a velvet box to reveal a massive, ostentatious gold necklace. Meifeng looked at the necklace. Her analytical brain immediately went to work. The clasps are weak. The gold is an alloy likely no more than 60% pure. It weighs approximately 2 caddies, making it a severe ergonomic hazard for the cervical spine. "I have come to formally request your hand in marriage," Wang announced, puffing out his chest. "I can offer you an estate twice this size, and you would never have to look at another ledger again." "Master Wang," Meifeng started, perfectly prepared to deliver a statistically devastating rejection. She didn't get the chance. The heavy iron gates of the courtyard swung open with a deafening screech. Long Wei rode in at the head of his patrol. He was covered in a thick layer of road dust, his dark leather armor scratched, his jaw set in a hard, exhausted line. But sitting securely around his topknot, miraculously intact, was the blush-pink silk ribbon. He swung down from his horse, his boots hitting the packed earth with a heavy thud. He took one look at the velvet boxes, the flashy merchant, and Meifeng standing on the veranda, and his entire demeanor shifted from exhausted commander to lethal predator. He took the stairs 2 at a time, coming to a halt directly between Meifeng and the merchant. He smelled of sweat, horses and sandalwood, and Meifeng had never been so happy to see anyone in her life. General Long. Wang squeaked, taking a rapid step backward as the towering warrior loomed over him. I know exactly what you are doing, Wang, Long Wei growled, his hand resting casually, yet terrifyingly, on the pommel of his sword. You are trespassing in a restricted military zone. Trespassing? I am a respected merchant. I came to court the Imperial auditor. Denied, Long Wei stated flatly. Wang blinked. I beg your pardon? You cannot deny a courtship. She is a woman of the capital, she is free to. She is under Imperial contract, Long Wei interrupted, crossing his massive arms over his chest. He looked the merchant up and down with absolute disdain. Her current assignment is a matter of critical national security. The financial optimization of this estate requires absolute, unbroken concentration. Meifeng bit the inside of her cheek so hard she tasted blood, desperately trying to suppress a laugh. He was weaponizing her own vocabulary. But surely she can entertain a suitor after hours. Wang protested, sweating profusely now. There are no after hours, Long Wei lied smoothly, taking a menacing step forward. The ledgers require constant surveillance. Her cognitive bandwidth is entirely requisitioned by the Emperor. And furthermore, your presence here is a logistical hazard. You are disrupting the workflow. The workflow? Wang echoed, looking entirely bewildered. The workflow, Long Wei confirmed darkly. And if you do not remove yourself and your substandard gold alloys from my courtyard in the next 10 seconds, I will classify you as an enemy combatant and have my tactical goats deal with you. Master Wang didn't need to be told twice. He shrieked, spun around, and practically dove into his carriage, his servants scrambling after him. Meifeng and Long Wei stood on the veranda in silence, watching the lacquered carriage careen out of the gates, kicking up a massive cloud of dust. When the courtyard was finally quiet again, Meifeng slowly turned to face the general. My cognitive bandwidth is requisitioned by the Emperor? She asked, arching a single perfect eyebrow. Long Wei finally looked at her. The lethal glare melted away, replaced by a sheepish, incredibly handsome grimace. He reached up, rubbing the back of his neck, his fingers brushing against the blush-pink ribbon. It was the most efficient way to neutralize the threat, he muttered, looking down at his dusty boots. He was offering me a very large estate, General. Long Wei's head snapped up, his dark eyes flashing with a sudden fierce possessiveness. He stepped closer, crowding her against the wooden railing of the veranda. The scent of him enveloped her completely. He is a fool who thinks he can buy you, Long Wei said, his voice dropping to a low, rough whisper that made her knees weak. He doesn't understand your value. He doesn't know that you prefer sage green over gold, or that you drink jasmine tea when you're frustrated with the inventory. He reached out, his callous thumb gently brushing a speck of dust from her cheek. Your contract is with this estate, Meifeng, he breathed, his gaze locked intensely on hers. And I am not authorizing a transfer. Chapter 9. It's physically impossible for 3 tons of raw silk to simply evaporate, General. Meifeng stood in the center of the study, a massive unrolled map of the western province pinned to the floor with 4 heavy inkstones. She was pacing around the edges of it, her sage green robe sweeping over the woven mats, her abacus clutched in her hand like a weapon of mass calculation. Long Wei was leaning against the heavy oak desk, arms crossed, watching her with that infuriatingly fond expression he had adopted since chasing off Master Wang. He had finally changed out of his armor into a dark blue tunic, his hair still securely tied back with her blush-pink ribbon. Bandits, Long Wei offered mildly. The Black Wind clan has been active near the mountain pass. Bandits lack the logistical infrastructure to move 3 tons of silk without leaving a trace, Meifeng countered, flicking a bead on her abacus with a sharp clack. I cross-referenced the toll station ledgers from the past week. A caravan matching the weight profile of our missing silk passed through the eastern checkpoint, the opposite direction of the Black Wind territory, 3 days ago. But they claimed they were transporting grain. Long Wei pushed off the desk, his tactical interest instantly piqued. He crouched down beside the map, his broad shoulder brushing against her knee. Show me. Meifeng pointed to a small dot on the map with the tip of her wolf hairbrush. Here. The toll collector noted a significant axle depression on the carts, indicative of high-density weight. Grain doesn't depress axles that deeply unless it's soaked, and it hasn't rained in the east for 2 weeks. Furthermore, the caravan paid the toll in Imperial silver, not trade barter, which is highly unusual for grain merchants. Long Wei traced the line from the checkpoint to a jagged cluster of mountains near the border. If they went east, they are heading for the old smuggling routes. There's an abandoned mining camp in the Blackwood Ravine. It has the storage capacity for that much cargo. He looked up at her, his dark eyes gleaming with a mixture of predatory anticipation and absolute awe. You found a 3-ton needle in a provincial haystack without ever leaving this room. I tracked the data, Meifeng said, her breath hitching slightly at his proximity. The numbers never lie. Now you need to go retrieve my silk. The winter uniforms depend on it. I will take 20 riders, Long Wei said, standing up in a fluid lethal motion. We ride out within the hour. Excellent. I will prepare my riding cloak. Long Wei froze halfway to the door. He turned slowly. Absolutely not. You are staying here behind the fortified walls where it is safe. I am the Imperial auditor, Meifeng said, lifting her chin, refusing to be intimidated by the sudden thunder in his expression. I must personally verify the asset recovery and document the seizure of contraband. It is protocol. Protocol be damned, Long Wei growled, taking a step toward her. It's a smuggler's den, Meifeng. There will be armed men. And you are the general of the southern border, she replied, holding her ground. Are you telling me you cannot guarantee the safety of one auditor? It was a direct challenge to his competence, precisely calculated to bypass his protective instincts. Long Wei's jaw clenched. A muscle ticked in his cheek. Fine, he gritted out. But you stay glued to my side. If a blade is drawn, you duck behind my shield. Optimized, Meifeng agreed smoothly. 3 hours later, Meifeng was regretting her dedication to protocol. The ride to Blackwood Ravine was grueling, the terrain rocky and treacherous. But as the sun dipped beneath the horizon, painting the sky in violent shades of orange and purple, Long Wei signaled for the column to halt. They dismounted, creeping to the edge of a steep ridge. Below them, nestled in a dark ravine, was a cluster of wooden structures. Heavy wooden carts were parked outside, and armed men milled about by the light of several torches. Wait here, Long Wei whispered, his breath warm against her ear as he pressed her gently behind a massive boulder. He drew his sword, a magnificent, terrifying length of dark steel that hummed in the quiet air. What followed was a masterclass in kinetic violence. Meifeng peeked around the boulder, watching as Long Wei and his men descended upon the camp like a shadow. There were shouts, the sharp clash of steel, and the chaotic scramble of smugglers realizing they were entirely outmatched. Long Wei moved with devastating efficiency, his glaive a blur of motion, disarming 3 men before they even realized they were under attack. It was over in less than 10 minutes. The smugglers were bound, the camp secured. Clear! Sergeant Bai shouted. Meifeng hurried down the ridge, her heart pounding. She found Long Wei standing inside the largest wooden shed. He was unharmed, his breathing barely elevated, wiping a smear of soot from his cheek. Surrounding him were stacks of wooden crates. One had been pried open, revealing bolts of shimmering raw white silk. Asset recovered, Long Wei said, a slow, triumphant grin spreading across his face as she entered. Meifeng walked up to the crate, running her hand over the smooth fabric. She let out a long breath she hadn't realized she was holding. She turned to look at the general. He was already looking at her. The air in the dusty, dimly lit shed suddenly felt incredibly charged. The adrenaline of the raid mixed with the undeniable reality of what they had just accomplished. You found them, Long Wei said softly, stepping over a discarded crowbar to close the distance between them. No scout, no spy could have tracked them this fast. You saw the invisible. And you retrieved them, Meifeng breathed, looking up at him. A calculation is useless without the force to execute it. He stopped just inches away. He reached out, his large hands gently grasping her waist, the leather of his bracers cool against her silk robes. Brain and brawn, he murmured, his thumb lightly stroking the fabric at her hip. Strategy and execution. We are a terrifying combination, scholarly. A perfect synergy, she agreed, her voice trembling slightly as she looked up into his dark, hungry eyes. In the dim light of the smuggler's den, surrounded by recovered silk and the fading adrenaline of a battle won, the line between them didn't just blur. It completely dissolved. Long Wei lowered his head, and this time, there was no thunderstorm to interrupt them. Chapter 10. The southern border, Meifeng decided, had an incredibly dramatic climate. Exactly 1 week after the raid on the smuggler's den, the sky over the estate broke open once again, unleashing a torrential, unrelenting downpour. But this time they weren't trapped in a freezing mountain hut. They were trapped on the sweeping, covered veranda outside the estate's expansive library. Meifeng sat on a low wooden bench, a small brazier glowing warmly at her feet. On her lap rested her abacus and a heavily annotated scroll regarding the cavalry's winter fodder. She stared at the bamboo slips, then at her abacus and then back at the slips. She let out a frustrated huff, her breath pluming in the damp, cool air. Is the winter fodder rebelling against your calculations, scholarly? Long Wei was leaning against the heavy wooden pillar of the veranda, watching the rain sheet off the curved clay tiles of the roof. He was wearing a simple dark tunic, his arms crossed over his chest. He looked impossibly relaxed for a man whose estate was currently failing basic arithmetic. The fodder is fine, Meifeng said, tapping her wolf hair brush against her chin. It is your personal stable ledger that is currently defying the laws of mathematics, and logic, and reality. Long Wei didn't turn around, but she saw the slight stiffening of his broad shoulders. I assure you my stablemaster is highly competent. Your stablemaster may be competent with horses, but whoever filled out this specific ledger is either deeply intoxicated or actively trying to give me an aneurysm, Meifeng declared, standing up and marching over to him. She thrust the scroll under his nose. Look at this. According to column 4, you traded 3 sacks of oats for 12 Andalusian warhorses. And in column 6, it states that the horses consume -4 bushels of wheat a day. General, your horses are not generating wheat. They are eating it. Furthermore, you categorized a purchase of 300 iron horseshoes as medicinal herbs. Long Wei looked down at the scroll, his expression carefully blank. A clerical error. A clerical error is a misplaced decimal, Meifeng snapped, her frustration boiling over. The kiss in the smuggler's den had shifted the ground beneath them, leaving her completely off balance. He had been looking at her with that dark, intense hunger for a week, but their days were still consumed by the audit. And the audit was suddenly dragging. This is structural sabotage. Every time I close a department's ledger, a new catastrophic mathematical anomaly appears in yours. She poked him in the center of his solid chest with the tip of her brush. You are not a stupid man, Long Wei. In fact, you are terrifyingly sharp. So why are your personal accounts suddenly reading like they were drafted by Commander Whiskers? He looked down at the brush pressed against his chest, then slowly raised his eyes to meet hers. The relaxed demeanor evaporated. The air on the veranda suddenly felt hotter than the glowing brazier. Because if the ledgers are balanced, Long Wei said, his voice a low, rough rumble over the sound of the rain, the audit is finished. Meifeng froze. What? Long Wei took a step forward, forcing her to tilt her head up to maintain eye contact. If the numbers align scholarly, you will pack your sage green robes, your abacus, and your terrifying efficiency into a carriage, and you will return to the capital. Meifeng's breath hitched. Her highly analytical mind scrambled to process the data he was feeding her. You are deliberately corrupting the data? I wrote that the horses generate wheat, he confessed, leaning in, his gaze dropping to her lips. I categorized iron as herbs. Yesterday, I deliberately spilled ink over the armory manifest, just so you would have to spend 3 hours sitting at my desk to rewrite it. That is treasonously inefficient. Meifeng gasped, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. It is desperation, Long Wei countered, his large hands coming up to gently grasp her upper arms. He pulled her a fraction of an inch closer, entirely enveloping her in the scent of sandalwood and rain. I have fought warlords, Meifeng. I have held the border against armies. But the thought of those heavy iron gates closing behind your carriage terrifies me more than 1,000 enemy swords. Long Wei, she breathed, the brush slipping from her fingers and clattering to the wooden floorboards. I don't care about the numbers anymore, he murmured, his thumb brushing against the silk of her sleeve. I don't care about the budget. I am sabotaging my own estate because it is the only strategic maneuver I have left to keep you here. The confession was absurd. It was completely illogical. The general of the southern border was purposefully failing math to keep his auditor from leaving. It was the most romantic thing she had ever heard. Meifeng looked up into his dark, desperate eyes. The walls of her professional composure, built so carefully over years in the Imperial treasury, completely crumbled. She reached up, her small hands tangling in the fabric of his dark tunic, and pulled him down to her. Long Wei let out a ragged breath, wrapping his massive arms around her waist and lifting her slightly off her feet. The kiss was consuming, fueled by weeks of stolen glances, bickering over scrolls, and the heavy, undeniable tension of the Borderlands. It was the absolute perfect alignment of two entirely different variables. Outside the eaves of the library, the rain continued to pour, washing away the dust of the courtyard. But underneath the shelter of the roof, Meifeng finally stopped calculating the odds, completely surrendering to the one equation she never wanted to solve. Chapter 11. For 3 glorious, secretly chaotic weeks, the Imperial audit of the southern border was suspended in a state of deliberate mathematical purgatory. Meifeng spent her days in the study, pretending to aggressively untangle the General's manufactured accounting disasters, while Long Wei spent his time inventing increasingly ridiculous clerical errors, just to watch her eyes narrow in frustration before he leaned across the desk to kiss her. But Meifeng was fundamentally too good at her job. Even with the General actively sabotaging the inventory, claiming a shipment of iron shields had been eaten by termites, the numbers inevitably began to align. The final clack of the abacus bead sounded exceptionally loud in the quiet study. Meifeng stared at the finalized ledger. It was perfectly balanced, bound in a crisp cream-colored ribbon. The estate was financially optimized. The audit was over. I could set it on fire, Long Wei suggested from his place by the window. He wasn't wearing his armor today, just a dark, comfortable tunic, his hair tied back with the now familiar blush pink silk. Meifeng offered a weak, watery smile, tracing the edge of the bamboo slips. As much as I appreciate your dedication to arson, General, I have already sent 3 preliminary reports to the Treasury. They know the final tally is imminent. Before Long Wei could offer another treasonous suggestion involving Commander Whiskers and the remaining ledgers, the heavy blast of a horn echoed from the watchtower. It wasn't the deep booming sound of a border threat. It was a high, sharp series of 3 blasts. An Imperial courier. The playful atmosphere in the study vanished instantly. Long Wei's posture straightened, the relaxed lover vanishing as the hardened commander snapped into place. They both hurried out to the veranda. A rider on a lathered horse was galloping through the newly opened iron gates, a bright yellow pennant snapping in the wind, the color of the Emperor. The courier practically fell off his horse, dropping to one knee in the dust as Long Wei descended the stairs. He held up a scroll encased in a carved jade tube. An Imperial mandate, General, the courier gasped. For scholarly Meifeng. Meifeng's heart plummeted into her sensible boots. She walked down the steps, her hands trembling slightly as she took the jade tube. She broke the seal and unrolled the yellow silk. The characters were stark and unyielding. The audit is concluded. Your expertise is required in the capital for the autumn tax assessment. Return immediately. She read it twice, the words blurring together. She looked up at Long Wei. I have been recalled, she whispered. For a fraction of a second, she saw the devastating heartbreak in his dark eyes. A raw, desperate flash of the man who had kissed her in the rain. But then as quickly as it appeared, it was gone. The terrifying, untouchable general of the southern border descended like a heavy iron curtain. His jaw locked. His shoulders squared. The warmth in his eyes froze into impenetrable obsidian. He was a man who had dedicated his entire life to the Emperor's command. An Imperial mandate was absolute law. To defy it or even to openly mourn it bordered on treason. The Emperor's will is absolute, Long Wei said, his voice entirely stripped of emotion. It was flat, clipped and horrifyingly professional. Meifeng flinched as if he had struck her. Long Wei. You must pack scholarly, he interrupted smoothly, stepping back, physically putting distance between them. I will have the quartermaster prepare a carriage and a 6-man escort to ensure your safe travel through the mountain passes. Is that it? She asked, her voice cracking, her professional composure fracturing. A carriage and an escort? You are an Imperial auditor, he replied, refusing to meet her eyes, looking instead toward the watchtower. Your duty is in the capital. My duty is to guard the border. He turned on his heel. Sergeant Bai, he barked, his voice echoing across the courtyard, commanding and cold. Prepare the carriage. The scholar leaves at dawn. Meifeng stood completely frozen in the center of the courtyard, the yellow silk scroll crinkling in her grip. The rejection was agonizing. She knew it was the mandate, she knew it was his duty, but the sheer speed of his withdrawal felt like a physical blow. The man who had wrestled a goat for her, who had bought her a rose gold comb, who had admitted he was terrified of losing her, had just locked her out completely. She turned and walked back to her quarters, her vision blurred with unshed tears. That night, Meifeng packed her few belongings. She folded her sage green robes. She carefully wrapped her abacus in linen. But when she reached for the rose gold cherry blossom comb resting on her vanity, her hand hesitated. She picked it up, the cool metal a stark contrast to the burning ache in her chest. She carefully secured it in her hair. It was entirely illogical to keep it, but as she tied her belongings into a neat, efficient bundle, it was the only piece of the southern border she couldn't leave behind. Chapter 12. The journey back to the capital took 14 days, and Meifeng spent every single one of them making her 6-man escort wish they had chosen a peaceful life of turnip farming instead of the military. Long Wei, in his infinite, infuriating stoicism, had clearly given them terrifying orders regarding her safety. The soldiers rode in a tight, hyper-defensive formation, glaring at every passing squirrel as if it were a highly trained assassin from the Black Wind clan. Meifeng, heartbroken and running on 3 hours of sleep, channeled her emotional devastation into aggressive, unsolicited logistical consulting. "Sergeant Ma!" she yelled out the carriage window on day 3, her abacus clicking menacingly. "The left axle of this carriage is unlubricated. The resulting friction is reducing our velocity by 8%. If we are ambushed by bandits, we will die with squeaky wheels. It is tactically embarrassing. I will grease it at the next outpost, scholarly." Sergeant Ma yelled back, looking like he wanted to weep. On day 6, she audited their trail rations. She made the entire escort line up by the side of the road while she inspected their saddlebags. "This ratio of salted pork to dried persimmon is statistically criminal. You are all marching toward scurvy. Who packed this? I want names." By the time the towering, imposing gates of the capital finally came into view, the heavily armed escort looked like they had barely survived a grueling war, while Meifeng just looked profoundly, deeply annoyed. The Imperial treasury was exactly as she had left it. It was a massive, hushed hall filled with the quiet scratching of brushes, the smell of expensive soot ink, and men who had never seen the sun. Before the southern border, this room had been her sanctuary. Now it just felt like a tomb with excellent lighting. Her superior, Minister Chun, a man who looked like a stiff breeze might snap him in half, greeted her with tearful joy. "Skulali. The gods be praised." Chun wept, fluttering around her desk like a panicked moth. "The autumn tax assessments are a disaster. The Ministry of Rights overspent their incense budget by 40 taels of silver. It is sheer anarchy." Meifeng stared at him. She thought about Long Wei tackling a goat to save an imperial mandate. She thought about a midnight raid on a smuggler's den. She thought about the general's completely fabricated claim that Andalusian warhorses photosynthesize their own food. 40 taels, Meifeng repeated flatly. "Minister Chun, that is a rounding error. Have you tried simply intimidating the incense merchants with a broadsword?" Chun gasped, clutching his pearls literally. He wore a very tasteful strand of pearls hidden under his robes. "A broadsword? In the Ministry of Rights? Heavens, Meifeng, the border has made you feral." "The border made me efficient," she muttered, sitting down at her perfectly organized, painfully empty desk. For 3 days she tried to reintegrate. She balanced the incense budget. She optimized the emperor's koi pond feeding schedule. She organized her bamboo slips by both color and chronological dynasty. But it was useless. Every time the heavy treasury doors opened, her head snapped up, fully expecting a towering, exasperated general to walk in complaining about missing arrowheads. Every time it rained outside the palace windows, her face flushed with the phantom heat of a shared wool blanket. And the dead silence of the treasury was driving her absolutely insane. On the 4th day she snapped. She was reviewing a highly detailed proposal for the aesthetic realignment of the palace rock gardens when her brush simply stopped. She looked at the delicate characters. She looked at her wooden abacus. She stood up. The heavy wooden chair scraped loudly against the polished floor, echoing through the hushed hall and causing 3 nearby scholars to jump in terror. "Skulali." Minister Chun squeaked from 2 desks over. "Is there a mathematical issue with the Petunia budget?" "Yes," Meifeng announced loudly, her voice ringing out across the silent treasury. "The issue is that petunias are a low-yield ornamental crop with 0 tactical advantage, and I am entirely out of cognitive bandwidth for this nonsense." She slammed her abacus onto the desk with a sharp crack. I need a chaotic variable, she declared, gathering her sage green skirts. I need a man who doesn't know how to use a filing system. And I need a tactical goat. Minister Chan stared at her in absolute, unadulterated horror. What? I quit, Meifeng said. She turned on her heel, marching toward the heavy doors with the lethal grace of a woman on a mission. She reached up, her fingers brushing the rose gold cherry blossom comb still firmly anchored in her hair. She was an Imperial auditor. She fixed broken systems. And she had left the most infuriating, handsome, mathematically incompetent system, sitting entirely alone at the southern border. It was time to go optimize his life. Permanently. Chapter 13. Meifeng's highly dramatic, career-ending exit from the Imperial Treasury was somewhat derailed by a massive commotion in the central courtyard of the palace. She had fully intended to march straight to the Imperial stables, requisition the fastest horse available, and ride south until she smelled sandalwood and dust. But as she descended the marble steps of the treasury, a squad of palace guards scrambled past her, their spears clattering in panic. The heavy bronze-studded gates of the inner palace were wide open. Striding through them, ignoring the frantic protests of the Imperial Chancellor, was General Long Wei. He was not wearing his dark leather armor. He was dressed in the full, suffocatingly heavy formal court robes of a high-ranking military official, layers of rich, dark blue silk embroidered with silver dragons. He looked magnificent. He also looked like he was about 5 seconds away from murdering someone with his bare hands. Trailing nervously behind him was Sergeant Bai, struggling under the weight of a wooden crate overflowing with bamboo slips. General Long, the Imperial Chancellor sputtered, hurrying to keep up with Long Wei's massive strides. You cannot simply barge into the Imperial court without a formal summons. Is there an invasion? Have the border walls been breached? Worse, Long Wei announced, his voice booming across the courtyard and bringing the entire palace to a standstill. He marched directly toward the raised dais where the emperor's ministers were currently holding their morning session. The southern border is experiencing a catastrophic failure of basic infrastructure. The entire command chain is mathematically compromised. Meifeng froze behind a marble pillar, her heart leaping straight into her throat. He was using her vocabulary. Long Wei reached the minister's table and gestured sharply. Sergeant Bai dropped the heavy wooden crate onto the delicate mahogany surface with a terrifying crack. What is this? The Minister of Defense demanded, recoiling from the dust that plumed off the scrolls. This, Long Wei declared, slamming his hand on top of the pile, is a 50-page proposal for the immediate creation of the Department of Border Logistics. It outlines a critical restructuring of military asset management. The minister stared at him in utter bewilderment. The fearsome warlord of the South had ridden for 2 weeks across the country, breached the inner palace, and interrupted the Imperial court to submit paperwork? General, the Chancellor said slowly, as if speaking to a madman, we have a treasury to handle logistics. The treasury is inefficient. Long Wei barked, crossing his arms over his broad chest. Since you recalled your auditor, the southern border has descended into anarchy. The tactical goats have eaten the Western patrol map. The blacksmith is demanding to be paid in abstract poetry. And yesterday, I accidentally authorized the trade of a stone watchtower for 300 crates of slightly bruised turnips because I failed to carry the one. A collective gasp echoed through the courtyard. You traded a watchtower for turnips? Minister Chan whispered in horror, having scurried out of the treasury right behind Meifeng. I was under severe cognitive distress. Long Wei roared, turning his fierce glare on the trembling scholars. The structural integrity of my entire life was removed without warning. My command center is a disaster. I haven't slept in 2 weeks because I keep trying to categorize the armory by lunar phases, and I don't know how. He turned back to the stunned ministers, planting both hands on the table. The southern border cannot function without scholarly Meifeng, Long Wei stated, his voice dropping the angry volume but maintaining an intensity that made the air crackle. I am submitting this proposal for the Department of Border Logistics, and I am stipulating that it must be headed exclusively by her. She will have full autonomy, double her previous salary, and unlimited access to color-coded silk ribbons. The Chancellor blinked. General, that is highly irregular. Scholarly is currently optimizing the Petunia budget. To hell with the Petunias, Long Wei bellowed. Actually, a clear, sharp voice rang out across the courtyard. I quit the Petunias about 4 minutes ago. Long Wei froze. The sea of terrified scholars and guards parted. Meifeng stepped out from behind the marble pillar, her sage green robes a stark contrast to the brilliant reds and golds of the court. She gripped her wooden abacus in one hand. Long Wei slowly turned to face her. The terrifying, shouting warlord vanished instantly. He exhaled a long, shaky breath, the tension bleeding out of his massive frame. He stared at her, his dark eyes immediately dropping to the rose-gold cherry blossom comb sitting securely in her hair. "You quit?" he asked, his voice suddenly rough and quiet, meant only for her despite the hundreds of people watching. "The capital lacks a chaotic variable," Meifeng said, taking a slow step toward him, completely ignoring the whispering ministers. "And I was just informed that a certain general traded a military fortification for root vegetables, which is statistically the worst trade in the history of the dynasty." Long Wei closed the distance between them, stopping mere inches away. "It was a very confusing ledger, Meifeng. I needed an expert." "You rode all the way to the capital," she whispered, looking up at him, a watery smile breaking across her face. "You put on formal court robes. You wrote a 50-page administrative proposal." "I dictated it to Sergeant Bai," he admitted softly, a devastatingly handsome smirk finally touching his lips. "My handwriting is still terrible, but the sentiment is entirely accurate." He reached out, completely disregarding Imperial protocol, the Chancellor and the entire court, and gently rested his hand against her cheek. His thumb brushed over her cheekbone. "Come back to the border, Meifeng," he pleaded, the vulnerability in his dark eyes completely undoing her. "The ledgers are a disaster, and I am entirely, completely lost without you." Chapter 14. The Imperial courtyard was a place of hushed whispers, rigid protocol, and absolute reverence for the Emperor's peace. Currently it sounded like a flock of startled geese. Ministers were murmuring behind their silk sleeves. The Chancellor looked like he was vibrating with indignation. And Minister Chun had actually sat down on the marble steps, fanning himself frantically with a petunia budget scroll. Meifeng didn't care about any of them. The entire world had narrowed down to the warmth of Long Wei's calloused hand against her cheek and the desperate, naked hope in his dark eyes. "You traded a fortification for turnips," Meifeng repeated softly, shaking her head. "You are an administrative menace." "I am a man who recognized a critical vulnerability in his supply chain," Long Wei murmured, stepping even closer so the heavy silk of his formal robes brushed against her sage green skirts. "My heart was relocated to the capital without my authorization. I had to come retrieve it." "General Long," the Imperial Chancellor finally exploded, his voice cracking as he stomped down from the dais. "This is an outrage. You cannot storm the inner court to discuss feelings and border logistics. And you certainly cannot demand the promotion of a junior scholar to head a newly fabricated department without the Emperor's express consent." Long Wei didn't even look at the Chancellor. He kept his eyes locked firmly on Meifeng. "I am not just asking her to head a department," Long Wei said, his voice carrying effortlessly over the courtyard. He dropped his hand from her cheek and took a step back. Then, right in the center of the Imperial Palace, surrounded by the highest-ranking officials of the dynasty, the terrifying general of the southern border dropped to one knee. A collective high-pitched gasp echoed off the marble pillars. Minister Chun let out a faint squeak and slumped completely over onto the steps. Meifeng's hands flew to her mouth, her abacus slipping from her fingers and clattering to the courtyard floor. "Long Wei, what are you doing?" "I am submitting a formal petition for a permanent merger," Long Wei announced, looking up at her with a devastatingly handsome, entirely unrepentant smile. He reached into the deep sleeve of his formal robes and pulled out a small velvet-wrapped bundle. He flipped the velvet back. It wasn't a standard jade bangle or a flashy gold necklace like the merchant Wang had offered. It was a hairpin, forged from the same shimmering warm rose gold as her cherry blossom comb. But the head of the pin was shaped like a tiny, perfectly detailed abacus. The beads were made of minuscule, flawless pearls. Meifeng stared at it, her highly analytical brain completely short-circuiting. It was ridiculous. It was beautiful. It was the most perfectly calculated gift in the history of the world. "Li Meifeng," Long Wei said, his voice dropping an octave, rich and thick with emotion. "You are the most terrifying, ruthless, brilliant woman I have ever encountered. Before you arrived, my life was chaotic, unstructured, and entirely devoid of blush pink silk." He reached out and gently took her small, ink-stained hand in his massive one. I cannot offer you the safety of the capital. I can only offer you the dust of the border, a garrison of soldiers who are entirely terrified of you, and a highly uncooperative goat. He paused, his thumb brushing over her knuckles. But I also offer you absolute, unwavering loyalty. A lifetime contract. I want you to manage my estate, my ledgers, and my heart. Permanently. The courtyard was dead silent. Even the chancellor had stopped sputtering, staring at the warlord on his knee with wide, disbelieving eyes. Meifeng looked from the pearl-beaded abacus hairpin to the man who had ridden across the country just to surrender to her completely. The tears she had been fighting for 3 days finally spilled over, tracking down her cheeks. "General," she whispered, her voice trembling with a joy so fierce it felt like it might break her ribs. "A permanent merger carries significant operational risks. Have you calculated the long-term ROI?" Long Wei's smile widened, his dark eyes practically shining. "The return on investment is infinite, scholarly." "Then I accept your proposal," Meifeng cried, letting out a watery laugh. "On the condition that I never have to look at another Petunia budget for the rest of my life." "Done," Long Wei swore. He stood up, towering over her in his magnificent blue robes. He didn't bother waiting for a blessing from the chancellor or the court. He slid the rose gold and pearl hairpin securely into her hair, right beside the cherry blossom comb, then wrapped his massive arms around her waist and hauled her against his chest. He kissed her right there in the center of the Imperial palace. A deep, earth-shattering kiss that promised a lifetime of perfectly balanced ledgers and spectacular, unyielding love. Somewhere in the background, the court erupted into chaos. Guards were shouting, ministers were fainting, and Sergeant Bai was quietly trying to slide the crate of sabotage scrolls out of the chancellor's line of sight. But Meifeng simply wrapped her arms around Long Wei's neck, kissing him back with everything she had, knowing with absolute certainty that returning to the southern border was the best calculation she had ever made. Epilogue. 3 years later, the southern border was entirely, terrifyingly optimized. The newly constructed Department of Border Logistics was an architectural triumph of minimalist aesthetic. Meifeng had personally designed it, insisting on cream-colored plaster walls, wide windows that let in the morning sun, and soft sage-green silk hangings that dampened the noise of the bustling courtyard. It was the hour of the dragon, which meant it was time for Meifeng's morning productivity ritual. She sat at her massive oak desk, breathing in the faint, calming scent of jasmine incense. She perfectly aligned her wolf hair brushes parallel to her inkstone. She centered her primary ledger. And finally, she placed her wooden abacus exactly 3 inches from the edge of the desk. In her hair, the rose gold cherry blossom comb and the pearl-beaded abacus hairpin caught the morning light. She was just flicking the first earth beat of the day when the heavy doors slid open. "Report," Meifeng said crisply, not looking up. "The Western Garrison has requested a 10% increase in winter rations, Director Li," Sergeant Bai announced. He stood at perfect attention, holding a scroll bound in a neat, blush-pink ribbon. "Denied," Meifeng replied, her brush dancing across a bamboo slip. "They are hoarding salted pork. Tell them to rotate their current stock before I come down there and audit their root cellars." "Yes, Director." Bai saluted sharply, looking entirely relieved that he didn't have to face her wrath directly, and hurried out of the office. Silence descended once more, but it only lasted for precisely 4 seconds. Heavy, familiar footsteps echoed on the wooden floorboards. The scent of sandalwood and sweat filled the airy room, completely overpowering the jasmine incense. Meifeng let out a long, suffering sigh, resting her brush on the inkstone. She looked up. General Long Wei stood in the doorway. He had clearly just finished his morning drills on the training grounds. He was breathing heavily, his dark hair plastered to his forehead, and he was, as was becoming a severe statistical anomaly, completely shirtless. His chest and shoulders gleamed with sweat, the muscles shifting fluidly as he leaned against the doorframe. "General," Meifeng said, aggressively maintaining eye contact with his face. "Are there no tunics left in the southern province? Have we suffered a catastrophic textile shortage?" Long Wei's lips curved into a slow, wicked grin. He pushed off the doorframe and strolled into her pristine sanctuary, completely ignoring the unspoken boundaries of professional space. "A tactical choice, Director Li," he rumbled, coming to a stop right in front of her desk. "The southern humidity is oppressive today. I am simply optimizing my body temperature." "You are optimizing my blood pressure," Meifeng muttered. She reached for her abacus, desperately trying to focus on the grain yields, but her fingers fumbled the beads. He knew exactly what he was doing. Ever since he had realized that his physical proximity caused the brilliant, unflappable Imperial auditor to miscalculate her sums, he had weaponized it flawlessly. Before Meifeng could draft a formal reprimand regarding his uniform, a high-pitched giggle echoed from the hallway. "Onward, mighty steed!" a tiny voice commanded. Through the open doors trotted Commander Whiskers. The goat was slightly grayer around the muzzle, but just as stout and smug as ever. Riding victoriously on the goat's back was a 3-year-old girl with Long Wei's dark, expressive eyes and Meifeng's stubborn chin. Little Xia was dressed in a tiny, blush-pink halter top that Meifeng had meticulously crafted from the softest local baby wool, a relaxing hobby she had taken up during long, tedious strategy meetings. Her dark hair was pulled up into 2 messy buns, tied with matching silk scrunchies. "Mama!" Xia cheered, waving a half-eaten dried persimmon like a sword. "Whiskers and I are patrolling the perimeter." "I see that, little dragon," Meifeng smiled, her heart melting instantly as it always did. "Just ensure your steed does not patrol near the archive room. We do not eat official Imperial documents." Commander Whiskers bleated indignantly, chewing on what looked suspiciously like a piece of decorative parchment. Long Wei chuckled, a deep rumbling sound that filled the room. He reached down and effortlessly hoisted his daughter, and her persimmon, off the goat, settling her onto his broad, bare shoulder. Xia giggled, patting his sweaty head with sticky hands. Meifeng looked at the two of them, the fearsome warlord of the south, covered in sweat and toddler fingerprints, and the tiny girl who currently commanded the entire estate with an iron fist and a tactical goat. It was messy. It was loud. It was a complete departure from the rigid mathematical order she had once craved in the capital. Long Wei caught her staring. His teasing smirk softened into a look of such profound, quiet devotion that it still managed to steal the breath from her lungs after 3 years of marriage. He walked around the desk, carrying their daughter, and leaned down to press a soft, lingering kiss to Meifeng's temple. "Is the cognitive bandwidth fully requisitioned today, my love?" he whispered against her skin. Meifeng reached up, her ink-stained fingers resting against his warm jawline. She looked at the perfectly balanced ledgers on her desk, and then at the beautiful, chaotic family surrounding her. "My ledgers are completely balanced, General," she murmured, a bright, genuine smile breaking across her face. "I have everything I could ever possibly count." That's where this love story ends for now. If you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications for more romantic twists. Tell me in the comments what will you have done. Until the next story, keep craving romance.